I've processed missing persons cases for the past 11 years. I just opened a file with my daughter's name on it. The file came through at 7:22 a.m. on a Monday, routed to my desk the same way every other file arrived. County intake form, reporting party details, last known location, physical description, photograph. I'd opened thousands of them. My brain had developed the specific automation of someone who processes grief as paperwork for a living. Scan the face, note the hair color. I read the last confirmed sighting, flag for priority or standard processing. I clicked the attachment, the photograph loaded. And then my entire nervous system did something I can only describe as a controlled shutdown, the way a building loses power floor by floor when the main breaker trips. Because the face in the photograph was my daughter, Simone Yates, 19 years old, last seen leaving her college dormitory at Hargrove University at approximately 9:45 p.m. on a Thursday 6 days ago. Reporting party, Kezia Odom, roommate. The form noted that Simone had not contacted family or friends since her disappearance. Her phone had gone to voicemail consistently since Friday morning. No activity on her bank accounts, no confirmed sightings. I was looking at my daughter's face in a missing persons intake file. And the reason I was looking at it from my desk at the Mercer County Sheriff's Office Missing Persons Unit, rather than from a call with the detective assigned to the case, was simple and devastating. Nobody had told me. For 6 days, my daughter had been missing. For 6 days, I had been sitting at this desk processing other people's children, and nobody had told me. I'd been working missing persons for 11 years when Simone disappeared, which means I understood with clinical precision exactly what 6 days meant. In the first 72 hours of an adult disappearance, the statistical likelihood of a voluntary absence is high. College students leave, fight with roommates, go home without telling anyone, sometimes make impulsive decisions that look alarming from the outside and turn out to be benign. After 72 hours, the calculus shifts. After 6 days with no bank activity, no phone contact, no confirmed sightings, no returned calls. 6 days is a long time. I knew what 6 days meant. That knowledge sat in my chest like something with weight and temperature while I stared at my daughter's photograph on my work monitor and tried to remember how to breathe in a normal way. My name is Idiz Yates. I am 44 years old. I have spent 11 years at a desk in this unit, processing intakes, coordinating with detectives, flagging cases for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, building the administrative architecture of a search. I know every protocol, every database, every form. I knew all of it, and I had not known my own daughter was in the system. The file had been sitting in county intake for 6 days before it routed to my desk, which meant it had been assigned to someone else first, which meant there was a processing failure somewhere in the chain, which meant I needed to find the assigned detective before I fell completely apart. I picked up my desk phone. My hand was steady. Some part of my brain had decided the steadiness was the only available option. The assigned detective was a man named Ruben Achebe, who had been with the Hargrove University campus police for 9 years before transferring to county and had a reputation for being thorough and occasionally infuriating about the thoroughness, the kind of investigator who double-sourced everything and asked questions that felt tangential until they weren't. He was 48, heavy-set. With reading glasses he pushed up into his hair when he wasn't using them, which he was always not using. He answered on the second ring. I told him who I was and which file I was calling about. There was a pause on his end that contained several things at once: recognition, discomfort, and what I identified as the specific, careful quality of someone assembling what they need to say before they say it. "Mrs. Yates," he said, "I was going to call you today. I've been trying to reach you through the university contact listed on the form." I told him I was the university contact, that Simone had listed me as her emergency contact, that my work number and cell number were both on file at Hargrove. He said the university had given him a different number. He read it to me. It was one digit transposed from my actual cell number, a single inverted digit that had sent every call into a void for 6 days. I wrote the number down on my legal pad, very neatly, because my hands were still steady and I needed them to stay that way. Then I asked Detective Achebe to tell me everything he had. What he had was less than I needed and more than I could fully absorb in a single phone call. Simone had been seen leaving her dormitory Carver Hall at 9:45 p.m. the previous Thursday by her roommate Kezia, who had reported her missing the following Saturday morning after 2 days of unanswered texts and a missed plan to study together. Campus security footage confirmed Simone leaving Carver Hall at 9:48 p.m., walking in the direction of the main campus parking structure. A second camera caught her entering the parking structure at 9:52 p.m. After that, nothing. No footage of her leaving the structure on foot, no footage of her in a vehicle, nothing. The parking structure's east stairwell camera had been offline for maintenance since the previous Monday. Detective Achebe said the university's facilities department had confirmed this. He said he was pulling footage from street cameras on the roads adjacent to the structure, but the coverage was incomplete. He said Simone's phone had pinged a cell tower on the north side of Hargrove at 10:11 p.m. that Thursday, and had not pinged anything since. He said he was treating it as an active investigation. He said he was sorry I'd found out this way. I thanked him, wrote down his direct number, and ended the call. Then I sat very still at my desk for approximately 90 seconds. Then I picked up my phone again and called my ex-husband, Terrence Yates, who was Simone's father and who picked up on the fourth ring sounding half asleep despite it being after 7 in the morning, and I told him that our daughter was missing and had been for 6 days and that we needed to talk. Terrence had been out of active parenting for most of Simone's teenage years. Not absent, but distant in the particular way of a man who had good intentions and poor follow-through, who sent money and called on birthdays and showed up to graduations, but had not quite managed the daily weight of raising a child. He and I had divorced when Simone was 11, and the custody arrangement had been straightforward on paper and complicated in practice, and by the time Simone was 15, she was spending most of her time with me by her own choice, rather than court order. When I told Terrence about the file, about the 6 days, about the parking structure footage, the sound he made on the phone was not one I could categorize easily, somewhere between a sharp intake of breath and a word that didn't finish forming. I told him what I knew, which was everything Detective Achebe had told me plus 11 years of institutional knowledge about what the absence of evidence in the first 6 days can mean. I did not share all of that second category. Some things you don't say out loud while you're still trying to function. He said he was getting in his car. I told him to drive carefully and to meet me at the Hargrove campus, where I was going to be within the hour regardless of whether my supervisor approved it. My supervisor, a woman named Dorothy Frayne, who had 23 years in law enforcement administration, and who I had always found to be practical above all else, approved it without discussion when I walked into her office and put the file on her desk. She looked at the photograph. She looked at me. She said, "Go. Keep me updated. I'll coordinate with Achebe from this end." I was in my car by 8:15 a.m. The drive to Hargrove was 40 minutes on a clear morning and 50 on a congested one. It was 50. I spent those 50 minutes doing what I always told families not to do in the early stages of a missing persons investigation. I filled the unknown space with scenarios. Every red light was another 30 seconds of my brain constructing and dismantling possibilities, each one worse than the last. Each one checked against my professional knowledge of what the statistics said and what the evidence so far suggested. The parking structure bothered me most. Not because parking structures are inherently dangerous, but because of the camera. The east stairwell camera offline for maintenance, 6 days before Simone disappeared. I'd processed enough cases to know that camera outages were frequently benign, and occasionally not, and that the question of whether that particular camera's timing was coincidental or deliberate was one that someone with access to the facility's maintenance schedule could answer. When I called Detective Achebe from the car and asked him if he'd pulled the work order for the camera maintenance, he said he had. I asked who had submitted the request. He said facilities staff, routine rotation. I asked if he had the name of the individual who'd submitted it. There was a brief pause. He said he'd look into it. I thanked him and kept driving. That pause told me he hadn't thought to pull that specific detail yet, which told me something about the shape of his investigation so far, which was not a criticism of Ruben Achebe as a detective, but was a recognition that I needed to be involved in this in a way that went beyond a waiting family member. Kezia Odom met me in the lobby of Carver Hall at 9:40 a.m. She was 20 years old, a biology pre-med student from Lagos by way of Toronto, a small young woman with natural hair and an expression that had been carrying guilt for 6 days and showed it. She shook my hand and looked at me with the specific intensity of someone who needs to tell everything they know and has been waiting for the right person to tell it to. I had met 100 families in 11 years who looked at me that way. Sitting across from it in the context of my own child was a different experience entirely. We sat in a study room off the main lobby and she talked for 40 minutes without significant prompting. Well, which is what happens when someone has been waiting 6 days to be fully heard. The main thing Kezia told me, the thing that she said she had mentioned to Detective Achebe but felt hadn't been taken seriously enough, was about a man. Not a romantic interest, not a professor, not anyone connected to the university in any official capacity. A man Simone had mentioned twice in the weeks before she disappeared. She'd described him as someone she'd met through a tutoring app, that he'd helped her with her statistics coursework, and that he'd been generous with his time in a way Simone found slightly unusual. She said he'd offered to pay for her textbooks, Kezia told me. She said she'd declined and he'd been fine about it, but it had been a little weird. The second time she mentioned him was the week before she disappeared. She said he'd texted her saying he was going to be near campus and asking if she wanted to grab coffee. I asked Kezia if Simone had told her the man's name. She said Simone had called him Ned. She said she didn't know a last name. She said she told Detective Achebe this. I wrote Ned in my notebook, underlined it, and asked Kezia if she knew which tutoring app. The tutoring app was called StudyBridge, a platform that connected students with independent tutors. Common enough that 3 of the other missing persons cases I'd worked in the past year had involved it tangentially. I pulled it up on my phone while I was still in the study room and searched for tutors listing statistics as a specialty in the Hargrove University area. 11 results. I screenshotted all of them, noting the ones whose profile photos were male, which narrowed it to 6. One of the 6 used only a first name in his profile, Ned. His rating was 4.8 stars across 19 reviews, which was high enough to look legitimate and recent enough that the reviews spanned the past 14 months. His profile photo showed a white man in his late 30s with close cropped dark hair and what I can only describe as a deliberately nondescript face. Not memorable in any specific direction, the kind of face that doesn't leave a strong impression. And I sent the screenshot to Detective Achebe with a message that said, Kezia told you about this person. Pull his full account information from StudyBridge immediately. His name is Ned. Possible last name unknown. This needs to be today. I did not phrase it as a suggestion. 11 years in the system had taught me the difference between how you talk to investigators when you're a colleague and how you talk to them when you're a family member. And for the first time in my career, I was navigating that line from both sides simultaneously. Achebe responded within 4 minutes. Already requested? Should have it by this afternoon. I put my phone in my pocket and went to find the parking structure. The parking structure at Hargrove was a 4-level concrete facility connected to the main academic buildings via a covered walkway on the 2nd level. I walked through it at 10:45 a.m. with my professional eyes on, which meant I was looking at camera placements, sightlines, access points, areas with reduced visibility. The east stairwell was exactly what the reports described. A standard concrete stairwell with a camera mount on the ceiling of the 2nd floor landing that was currently empty, the camera removed for what facilities had described as scheduled maintenance. I stood in that stairwell for a few minutes. The lighting was adequate on the main landings and inadequate in the corners. The stairwell was accessible from the parking level and from the covered walkway and from a side exit that opened onto a service road running along the east side of the structure. I walked to the service road. It was a single-lane asphalt road that ran between the parking structure and a chain-link fence separating the campus from a commercial district. There was no campus camera coverage of the service road. I stood on it and looked at where it led. North toward the main campus entrance, south toward a side street that connected to a residential area and then to the highway. If Simone had exited through that stairwell onto the service road, she would have been invisible from the moment she left the main parking level. I took photographs of everything, oriented them by compass direction, and sent them to Achebe with timestamps. Terrence arrived at the campus at noon, looking like a man who had driven too fast and hadn't slept before he started. We sat in the car for 20 minutes while I brought him current. He listened in the way that people listen when the information is coming too fast and too hard for full processing, nodding at intervals, asking questions that showed he'd heard the structure of what I was saying, even if the details hadn't fully landed. Terrence was not a man who handled uncertainty well. This was one of the things that had ended our marriage, or his specific difficulty with the space between knowing and not knowing, and I watched him work through that characteristic struggle while I talked. At one point he said, "You know more about this than the detective, don't you?" It wasn't quite a question. I told him I knew different things, that Achebe had investigative tools I didn't have for my position, and that we needed both. He accepted this, which was more gracious than I'd expected given the circumstances. I asked him if Simone had mentioned anyone new in recent conversations, any new connection or situation that felt slightly off. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "She called me 3 weeks ago about a problem with her financial aid. Said there'd been some discrepancy in her account and she was trying to figure it out. I told her to call the financial aid office. I assumed she sorted it out." I asked what kind of discrepancy. He didn't know the details. I wrote financial aid discrepancy in my notebook and circled it twice and felt something shift in the structure of what I was assembling. The call to Hargrove's financial aid office took 45 minutes to get through the right channels, during which I identified myself as both Simone's mother and a law enforcement official, which was technically accurate and practically useful. The financial aid administrator who finally spoke to me was a man named Oliver Strang, who had been with the university for 7 years and who pulled up Simone's account with the wariness of someone aware they might be looking at something they should have caught sooner. What he found was a direct deposit information change filed on Simone's account 6 weeks before her disappearance. The change had redirected her next disbursement, $3,600 for the spring semester, to a different bank account. The request had been submitted online through the student portal, authenticated with Simone's credentials. Simone had not submitted it. Oliver Strang's voice went careful and specific in the way of someone who understands they're now in territory with legal implications. He said he'd need to file an incident report. I told him to do that immediately and to preserve all access logs associated with that request, that they were potentially evidence in a missing persons investigation. I called Achebe from the parking lot and gave him everything. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Financial fraud connected to the disappearance changes the classification." I said I knew. He said, "I need to bring in our fraud unit and potentially the FBI if the bank account crosses state lines." I said, "Do all of it. Today." He said, Days, I need you to also step back slightly from the investigation end of this. I understand why you're doing what you're doing, but some of what you find needs to come through official channels with documented chain of custody, or it becomes difficult to use." I told him I understood. I told him I would document everything I'd gathered and submit it formally through Dorothy Frayne. Then I went back to my car and sat in it for 7 minutes doing nothing at all, just existing in the specific silence of a person who knows too much and can do too little at the same time. The FBI's involvement came through on the third day after I'd found the file. Special Agent Comfort Asante, who had been with the Bureau's Criminal Investigative Division for 12 years, with a specialty in crimes against persons, called me directly at 6:14 p.m. on a Wednesday. She had a precise, unhurried way of speaking that communicated both competence and controlled urgency, and she asked me questions that told me she'd already done significant background work before the call. She had the Study Bridge account information. The man listed as Ned in the tutoring platform was Ned Larrivee, 39 years old, currently residing in a rental property in Oak Haven, a town 14 miles from the Hargrove campus. His real name, the one attached to his social security number and his driver's license, was Edmund Larrivee. He had a prior arrest in 2019 for fraud in connection with a financial scam targeting college students through a different tutoring platform, a charge that had been pleaded down to a misdemeanor with no jail time. He had a registered vehicle, a gray Subaru Outback. He had no current employer of record. The financial aid disbursement had gone to an account in his name at a credit union in Oak Haven. The account had been emptied 3 days after the transfer. Agent Asante told me all of this in the flat, orderly sequence of someone reading from organized notes. And then she said, "We have a search warrant for his residence being executed tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. I want you to know that because you have a right to know as a family member, and because I want you to hear it from me rather than through another channel." I told her I understood and asked her directly, what was her current assessment of Simone's situation? Agent Asante was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "We have no evidence of harm. We have significant evidence of fraud and of contact between Larrivee and your daughter. We are treating this as a high-priority active investigation. That's what the evidence currently supports." It was a careful answer. I'd given versions of that answer myself, to other families many times. I knew what it meant and what it was designed not to say. I didn't sleep that night, not meaningfully. I lay in the hotel bed I'd checked into 2 days ago when it became clear this wasn't a same-day resolution, and I ran through everything I knew in the ordered sequence I used with case files, trying to find the thread I was missing. Edmund Larrivee, known as Ned, had connected with Simone through a tutoring platform. He had accessed her student portal, either by obtaining her credentials directly or through some form of phishing or social engineering. He had changed her direct deposit information and redirected $3,600. He had then, approximately 6 weeks later, made contact with her in person. She had been seen entering the parking structure and not been seen leaving through any monitored exit. The east stairwell camera had been offline for maintenance since the Monday before. I kept coming back to the camera, the work order. Achebe had told me it was submitted by facilities staff, routine rotation. But I hadn't asked him to pull the specific individual's work history to verify whether similar maintenance requests had preceded other incidents. At 2:30 a.m., I sat up and texted Achebe. Need to know if Larrivee has any connection to university facilities staff. Anyone in the department who might have helped time a camera outage. He didn't respond until 5:48 a.m., 14 minutes before the search warrant execution. Already in it. Facilities worker named Dominic Reyes filed the maintenance request. Been employed at Hargrove 16 months, running his background now. The search of Larrivee's Oak Haven rental took most of the morning. I was not there. I was in a conference room at the Mercer County Sheriff's Office with Terrence and Dorothy Frayne and a victim advocate named Miriam Sato, who had 14 years working with families of missing persons and who sat beside me and said almost nothing for the first hour. Which was exactly the right thing to do. Agent Asante called at 11:22 a.m. She told me they had found evidence of multiple individuals at the residence. She told me they had found documentation, printed materials, notebooks, records of names, and student account credentials, targeting multiple universities over a period of at least 2 years. She told me they had found a burner phone with communications that were being analyzed. She told me Larrivee had not been at the residence when the warrant was executed. A BOLO had been issued. Then she said in a different register than any of what had come before, "We found a storage unit key. We're locating the corresponding unit now." Odd ease, we also found photographs of Simone and of several other young women. The photographs are recent and appear to have been taken in a residential setting that is not the Oak Haven address. I said, "Is she alive in the photographs?" Agent Asante said, "Yes." One word. I put my hand flat on the conference table and pressed it there and said, "Tell me what you need from me." The storage unit was registered to a shell entity called Oak Haven Property Solutions, traced within 4 hours to a mailbox service in Oak Haven that had been used by Larrivee under a different name, David Fenner. The unit was in a facility 11 miles east of the campus, and when Agent Asante's team opened it at 2:15 p.m., they found records, equipment, and a laptop that contained what the subsequent forensic analysis would describe as a systematic operation targeting college women across at least 6 universities over a period of 38 months. The fraud was the mechanism of contact. Larrivee would identify financial aid recipients, access their student portal credentials through phishing emails disguised as university financial communications, reroute a disbursement, and then use the financial leverage as a point of control, approaching the student directly, presenting evidence of the fraud, and threatening to report it to the university unless the student cooperated with him. In most cases, the cooperation he demanded was financial. Cash payments he framed as repaying the stolen disbursement to avoid university discipline. In several cases, the pattern had escalated differently. Simone's case was one of those. The laptop contained communications showing that Larrivee had been aware Simone was beginning to understand the shape of what he'd done. A message she'd sent him 3 days before she disappeared read, "I know what you did with my financial aid, and I've saved all our messages and I'm going to the university tomorrow." Larrivee's response, "Let's talk first, tonight. I can explain everything." The timestamp on his message was 9:15 p.m. on the Thursday she disappeared. She had been walking toward the parking structure 33 minutes later. Dominic Reyes, the facilities worker who had submitted the camera maintenance request, was brought in for questioning on the afternoon of the third day. He was 26 years old. He had been employed at Hargrove for 16 months and had a prior connection to Larrivee that went back 3 years. They had lived in the same apartment complex in a different county, and Reyes had a prior fraud charge from 2021 that Larrivee's prior attorney had also represented. The camera outage had not been coincidental. Reyes had submitted a fraudulent maintenance request for the east stairwell camera specifically, timed to coincide with Larrivee's planned meeting with Simone. In exchange, based on the messages found on the burner phone, Reyes had been paid $2,000. He cooperated fully from the first hour of questioning, providing everything he knew about Larrivee's operation, and critically, about a secondary property, a cabin in a rural area of Keswick County, approximately 90 miles from Hargrove, that Larrivee had mentioned to him as a place he used when things needed to cool down. Reyes didn't have an address. He had a description and a rough direction. It was enough. Agent Asante had Keswick County Sheriff's resources and her own team in the air within the hour. They found the cabin at 6:48 p.m. Edmund Larrivee was there. He had a prepared exit, cash, 2 additional sets of identification, a bag packed, but he hadn't used it yet. Agent Asante would later tell me he'd underestimated the speed of the investigation. He'd spent the previous 3 days believing the official response was still in early stages. He didn't know about me. He didn't know that a missing persons intake administrator with 11 years in the system had been in his file since the morning of day 6, pulling every thread, cross-referencing every name, texting investigators at 2:30 in the morning about work order histories. He'd been managing what he thought was a standard case response. He had not accounted for the specific combination of professional knowledge and parental motivation in the same person. Simone was at the cabin. She was physically unharmed. She had been held there for 6 days under threat, Larrivee had told her, with the specific calculated logic of a practiced manipulator, that if she left or contacted anyone, he would present the financial aid fraud to the university as something she had done, that he had documentation placing responsibility on her, that she would be expelled and potentially prosecuted. She had believed him. She had been 19 years old and lone, and she had believed the threat was credible because she didn't know how fraud investigations actually worked. She didn't know yet that her mother had spent 11 years knowing exactly how they worked. The call came from Agent Asante at 7:03 p.m. She said, "We have Simone. She's okay." I was in the car before the sentence was finished. The drive to the Keswick County Sheriff's substation where they'd taken Simone was an hour and 22 minutes, and I don't remember most of it. I remember the highway and the dark coming in, and the specific quality of high beams on rural asphalt, and the radio that I turned on, and then turned off because nothing seemed like the right thing to listen to on the way to your daughter. I remember parking the car and walking through the entrance and a deputy pointing me down a hallway. And I remember the door to the room where Simone was sitting with a victim advocate and a bottle of water and a blanket that she'd wrapped around her shoulders even though it wasn't cold. She looked up when I came in. She looked the way she'd looked when she was 8 years old and had a nightmare and came to find me in the dark. Not quite frightened anymore, but still very close to it. Still carrying the residue of something that had scared her badly. Yet I crossed the room and she stood up and we stood in the middle of that small room at the Keswick County Sheriff's substation and held on to each other, and she cried. And I didn't, not then, because the steadiness had carried me this far, and I needed it to carry me a few more minutes, long enough to be what she needed. She said, "How did you find me?" I told her I'd opened her file on Monday morning and I hadn't stopped working it since. She said, "You work missing persons." I said, "I do." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I didn't know it would be you." I said, "I know, I'm here now." Edmund Larrivee was charged with kidnapping, fraud, extortion, and unlawful restraint. Dominic Reyes was charged with conspiracy and obstruction. The federal charges connected to the interstate financial fraud operation added a layer of accountability that Larrivee's previous misdemeanor plea had avoided entirely. The forensic team's analysis of the laptop identified 22 additional victims across the 6 universities over 38 months, women who had been defrauded through the financial aid scheme and subjected to varying degrees of coercion and manipulation. 12 of them came forward after Larrivee's arrest, following contact from the FBI victim notification team. The charges expanded accordingly. The Hargrove University Financial Aid Office implemented a mandatory 2-factor authentication requirement for all direct deposit changes within 30 days of the investigation, a protocol change that had been recommended internally 18 months earlier and not implemented. The facilities department revised their camera maintenance request authorization process to require supervisor approval and documentation. Small procedural corrections, or the kind that get made after someone pays the cost of their absence. I've seen it happen in every institution I've ever worked with. The protocols exist after the harm, rarely before. Simone took a medical leave from Hargrove for the remainder of the semester and came home. We spent 3 months in the same house for the first time since she'd left for college, which was its own kind of recalibration. She was not the same person she'd been when she left. And I had not been unchanged by the 6 days I'd spent moving through her disappearance with professional tools and parental terror in equal measure. She started working with a therapist named Dr. Vivian Okoro, a trauma specialist with 14 years of clinical practice who had worked extensively with survivors of coercive control and who had a gift for meeting people exactly where they were without pulling them toward resolution before they were ready. I watched Simone in those months the way you watch something you nearly lost, with the specific grateful attentiveness of someone who understands that attention is not something to defer. I'd spent 11 years processing the paperwork of other people's worst days. I understood now, not fully connected the professional knowledge to the personal stakes. I knew what missing people cost their families in the abstract. I had not fully felt it until the abstract had my daughter's face. That knowing changed how I did the job afterward. Not the procedures, not the protocols, but the quality of presence I brought to the families who sat across the desk from me, the ones who were waiting for their file to move from intake to resolution. I understood their waiting differently. I'd been on the other side of the desk. Simone went back to Hargrove the following fall. She changed her major from business to sociology, a shift she said she hadn't fully been able to explain until a few months in, when she realized she'd become interested in how systems fail the people they're supposed to protect. She called me more than she had before. I picked up every time. At Christmas that year, she said something I've thought about many times since, while we were in the kitchen making the jollof rice my mother had taught me, and that I'd taught Simone when she was 12. She said, "The thing that scared me most, those 6 days, it wasn't being in the cabin. It was thinking that nobody knew where I was, that I was just gone and the world was continuing without me in it." I told her that the world had not continued without her in it. Not for one of those 6 days, not even for an hour. That one person had spent every hour of it working her file. She looked at me for a moment with the specific expression she got when something landed in a place she hadn't expected. Then she turned back to the stove and stirred the rice and said, "I know that now. Some things you can only know after the fact. Some things you have to come back from to fully understand what it meant that someone came to find you. She's safe now. That's the whole sentence. That's all I need."